was shoved forwards as somebody barreled into my back to force their way past my bus queue to get to their own. "Excuse you," I muttered, stepping into a puddle to keep my balance in place in the queue. The hole in the bottom of my boots made itself known as it had all the way to the bus station by letting in frigid water. "Asshole," I said under my breath. The bus rumbled and groaned as it rounded a corner and headed towards us. As it slowed to a stop, I noticed that something was a little bit off about it. The windows looked like they were tinted. But the doors opened and the queue started to shuffle forwards, distracting me from the odd windows. I smiled at the thought of taking the wake off my sodden and aching feet, even if it would only be for 30 minutes or so before I'd have to get out and walk again. I watched as the usual slew of people poured off the double-decker, all grumbling about the rain as they headed off into the city. My queue slowly shambled on board. I pulled my weekly pass out of my bag before I got to the driver so I could just walk on. Every time the queue had to stop so that somebody could fish a ticket out of their purse or pocket made my blood pressure go up. The queue had been building since the last bus left 20 minutes ago. I couldn't understand why so few people were prepared to get on the bus after standing for that long. I swallowed my irritation and continued the slow shuffle pause on board. As I stepped on, I held up my pass to the driver. I think he was new, as I hadn't seen him before, an older man with a very neatly trimmed moustache. He smiled and gestured for me to head on. I moved into the bus so as not to hold people up with polite chit-chat to the new driver and went upstairs. It was stiflingly hot up here. The air was thick and strong-smelling. We complain about the smell of wet dogs, but wet people don't exactly smell like a bunch of roses either. For a moment I wondered if somebody might have actually been ill. The smell was strong enough to make my stomach turn. I cracked a window and sat under it, hoping that once we got moving the odd and foul smell would clear. I pulled my hood down and unwrapped my scarf, already uncomfortable in the heat. I considered undoing my coat, but figured I'd be getting off again in half an hour, and that felt like a lot of faffing around. The bus steadily filled with people, and my seat at the back gave me a perfect view to people watch. The bus wasn't quite full when people stopped trickling in. There were still a few empty seats, but the heat and moisture in the air was almost suffocating. I breathed a sigh of relief when the engine purred louder and we moved, a bit of fresh air finally coming in through the open window. The man in the seat in front of me used his sleeve to wipe the condensation off the glass, allowing him to see outside. I pulled my headphones out of my handbag and slipped them into my ears, turning my music up loud enough so that I could hear it over the telephone calls and chatter of the other passengers. I could see the lights of the city through the condensation as we trundled through the busy streets. I watched as we passed blurred buildings and thought that they'd be lighting the Christmas lights soon. I always enjoyed the bus ride home at Christmas, seeing the lights every evening. We slowly eased out of the city, going with the flow of rush hour traffic. We turned onto the overpass and out into the countryside. The dual carriageway wasn't lit except by the lights of the cars and streetlights at junctions. Unable to see outside anymore due to the lights in the bus, I settled back and concentrated on staying awake. I jerked suddenly when my iPod suddenly rose in volume and then cut off entirely. I pulled my headphones out and looked at the music player. I held the on button down for a few seconds, but nothing happened. I tried again. Nothing. I figured the battery must have died and resolved myself to a long, boring journey with no view and no music. It was then that I realised the bus was silent. I looked up and frowned. I could have sworn there were more people on the bus when we left. There had only been 2 or 3 empty seats, but now there were at least a dozen. Had I fallen asleep? No. I knew where we were by the sway of the bus and the familiar corners and roundabouts on the carriageway. I hadn't fallen asleep. I looked into my bag to pull out my phone, but it was dead too. Odd, I mumbled to myself. It should have been fine. I'd been charging it at the office before I left. I looked around at the other passengers again and noticed that they all seemed to be slumped over. They were all asleep? I mean, it wasn't unusual for people to drift off on the bus home in the evening. It's a warm and relatively soothing environment, I suppose. I'd done it myself once. I even missed my stop. But it was unusual for everyone to fall asleep. The bus turned off the dual carriageway and onto a single-lane road, heading towards the first stop after the city. I watched as the small town's lights came into view. But the bell didn't ring, and the bus didn't stop. Instead, we kept going with nobody getting on or off. The same thing happened again at the next stop. The bus drove steadily through the town. No one rang the bell, and we didn't stop at the usual places. We didn't stop once. As the bus reached the crossroad at the edge of my town, we would normally turn left here, but my heart jumped into my throat when the bus turned right. I almost stood up, but stopped myself. Maybe there were just roadworks. So instead of getting up, I rubbed at the window, but it was too dark for me to see anything. The road wasn't lit, and because of the lights inside the bus, all I could see was my own worried reflection. I turned away from the window to see if anybody else was alarmed by the sudden change in direction, and I couldn't help the yelp that escaped me. I was alone on the top deck. This time I did stand up, but the bus turned unexpectedly, knocking me onto my backside. There were lights outside now. I assumed they were streetlights and tried to see if I could recognise where we were, but I couldn't see anything. Normally with streetlights I could see something, but all I could see was darkness and round, freestanding yellow lights. Okay, I said to myself, standing and holding on tight to the surrounding chairs. It's okay, just talk to the driver. I started towards the stairs, glancing at the seats as I went. They weren't all empty. One still had a shopping bag, another had a hat, one had a small soft toy. I was staring at the toy when I felt my left foot go out from under me. I slipped and landed on my backside, and instantly felt something soaking into my trousers. It was warm. What the? I managed, looking at my gloved hand. Bile rose in my throat when I saw what it was that I had slipped in. It wasn't water. It was blood. Blood covered the seat to my right, dripping onto the floor. I swore and ran downstairs. There were no passengers down here either. I walked to the driver's cab. Hello? What's going on? There's nobody here, and there's... The driver stared straight ahead, ignoring my concerns. Hello? I snapped. Are you listening to me? I banged on the plexiglass. He won't answer. He needs to concentrate on the road, a woman's voice said from behind me. I turned on my feet, but nobody was there. Hello? I said, my stomach in knots. I turned back to the driver. He was still staring blankly out the front window. I followed his gaze and flinched. It was utter darkness. Not just dark, total darkness. There was no visible road, no lights, not even headlights from the bus. Where's the road? I whispered, staring at my reflection. I screamed when I saw that there was something dark and shapeless reflected behind me in the glass. I turned, but nothing was there. You shouldn't have woken, a woman's voice said. Who's there? I shouted, looking to the front and then to the back of the bus. There was no one. I turned back to the front and saw my reflection in the window, and sitting at the back of the bus was a shadowy figure. I turned. Nothing was there. Who are you? I snapped. I looked at the reflection again and saw the same figure, only now they were several seats closer to me. Looking again at the real seat, there was nothing there. What's going on? Excuse me, what's going on? I said, turning back to the driver and banging on the plexiglass. He still didn't acknowledge me. But fuck you then! I snarled and turned away, facing the back of the bus, trying to think of what we should do. What do we do? The driver said suddenly. I turned to him. I cannot take those who are awake, the woman's voice said. Just open the doors. I looked to the driver. Well, what are you doing? I said. He hit a button and the bus doors opened. I could hear the wind howling past as we sped through the blackness. I looked out at the front window and saw the shadowy figure had moved again. They were right behind me. I felt sudden pressure on my back as something pushed me towards the open door. I screamed and fought the invisible assailant, but my struggle did nothing. They continued to push, and I couldn't stop them as they forced me off the bus and into the darkness.